They thought she was nothing more than a civilian traveler, a young woman in her late 20s with a sun-faded backpack, walking alone across the gravel approach to the checkpoint under the morning heat, her hair tied back, her steps steady but unhurried, like someone who had walked far longer roads than anyone there could imagine. And the MPs at the gate barely gave her more than a dismissive glance at first. The kind of glance reserved for tourists or contractors who wandered too close to where they didn't belong, until she stopped right in front of them, unbothered, unafraid, and when one of them asked with a smirk, "What's in the pack, ma'am?" "Snacks, souvenirs, maybe a selfie stick." She just let the silence hang there, her eyes calm, her shoulders square, because she knew what they didn't, and what they didn't know was about to change everything. Before we begin, if you believe respect should never be mocked, if you agree that women warriors have carried burdens most of us can't even name, then like and subscribe. Because this isn't just a story about a patch on a pack. It's a reminder that history walks quietly beside us, unseen, until someone makes the mistake of trying to laugh at it. The pack was old, not stylish, not tactical in the glossy way gear shops try to sell to recruits, but battered, stitched, carrying the weight of dust and rain and years, and across its surface were layers of faded threads, travel scars, and one patch sewn on the side. So frayed at the edges it almost looked like decoration, just a small embroidered hawk with wings folded sharp, the words Vector 1 barely visible beneath the wear. "Looks like she's cosplaying," another MP muttered, nudging his buddy, and they both laughed, that casual chuckle that pretends it's harmless but cuts like a blade. She didn't answer. She adjusted the strap higher on her shoulder and stood still as they circled her, their tone growing bolder because silence, to men like them, always felt like permission. "You know patches like that are stolen valor, right?" One of them sneered. "Bet you got that off eBay. You even know what it means." They laughed again, louder this time, until one leaned closer, tugging at the corner of the stitching like he might peel it off, saying, "This thing probably came from a thrift store in Fayetteville." That's when her voice finally cut through the morning air, low, measured, carrying the weight of something so absolute it silenced the gravel crunching under their boots. "Careful," she said, not angry, not pleading, just steady. "That patch isn't decorative." They froze for a moment, confused at her tone. Then one scoffed. "Oh yeah? And what are you supposed to be? Some lost contractor's kid sister?" She didn't blink. Her eyes stayed locked, sharp and level, her posture so precise it unsettled them even as they tried to laugh again. And then, from the small guard shack just off to the side, an older officer stepped out, coffee still steaming in his hand. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't moving fast either. He was staring, the color draining from his face as his eyes caught the shape, the pattern, the unmistakable symbol beneath the frayed stitching. His voice was almost a whisper, but in the silence that fell it carried farther than he meant it to. "Ghost Hawk." Vector 1. The two MPs turned sharply toward him, their laughter caught in their throats. They looked back at the patch, really looked this time, and their faces shifted from mock amusement to something colder, sharper, almost afraid. Because even if most had only heard rumors, every soldier who'd been around long enough knew that designation, whispered in corridors, scribbled in classified reports that never made it to archives. Ghost Hawk wasn't just another unit. Ghost Hawk was a phantom, a reconnaissance team so deep in the shadows that even mentioning it outside the right room could raise questions you didn't want asked. Vector 1 was worse. Vector 1 was the call sign no one ever expected to meet in person, the one people swore was just a myth, a story to keep rookies awake at night. The woman didn't move, didn't gloat. She just met their eyes and said softly, "We don't advertise. We finish the job." And in that single line, all their mockery collapsed into silence, the kind of silence that comes when people suddenly realize the joke has always been on them. The silence at that gate was heavier than the rifle slung across the MP's shoulders. And for the first time all morning they weren't sure if they were standing guard over the base or standing trial in their own ignorance. Because the young woman didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to flash credentials or demand anything. Her steadiness did it for her. And when the older officer's coffee slipped from his hand and shattered against the concrete, no one dared move to laugh at that either. Because the truth in his eyes had already told them what their mouths hadn't yet caught up to. This wasn't just some civilian with surplus gear. This was someone who had lived inside the kind of operations you only read about after they were declassified decades later, if they were ever declassified at all. One of the MPs stammered, "Ma'am, we're gonna need to see some identification." But his voice cracked on the last syllable, and she didn't reach for a wallet, didn't fumble in a purse, didn't even flinch. She just slid the backpack off one shoulder, set it down gently on the ground like someone placing down a memory too heavy to carry forever, and unzipped a side pocket with deliberate calm, pulling out nothing but a folded canvas sleeve, no larger than a hand, sealed with a strip of black fabric tape. She handed it over, wordless, and when the older officer, whose face had gone pale as stone, peeled the tape back, his hands shook, because inside were two small laminated cards, each one stamped with classification levels that made his pulse throb in his ears, and tucked behind them was a letter, the ink faded but the signature still carved sharp into history, a general's name, one that every man at that gate knew carried weight like iron. He swallowed hard, his jaw locking as he looked back at her, but she gave no expression, no explanation, just waited. Behind them, the base radio crackled with routine chatter, but here, at the gate, the world had gone still. One of the younger MPs tried again, desperate to reassert control, muttering, "Could be forged, could be faked. People make things look real all the time." But the words sounded hollow, and the officer snapped back, sharper than he'd ever spoken to his own men before. "You think anyone forges Ghost Hawk? You think anyone would survive 5 minutes flashing this if it wasn't real?" The MP went silent, his cheeks burning, and the woman finally reached down, lifting her pack back onto her shoulder like it weighed nothing at all, though every soldier watching subtly understood it had probably carried more lives and deaths than any of them would ever know. She turned slightly toward the checkpoint booth, her gaze steady, her words low but slicing through them. "We were never here for your recognition. We were here to make sure you came home." It was then that the convoy appeared, black SUVs rolling up the gravel like shadows made of steel, tires crunching, tinted windows hiding what no one at the gate had expected to arrive. Doors swung open in unison, boots hit the ground, and officers stepped out in dress uniforms so sharp the air itself seemed to stand straighter. The lead figure, a brigadier general, walked forward without hesitation, his hand rising into a salute before any of the MPs could even blink, and the young woman returned it slowly, precisely, as if she had done so 1,000 times in silence, but never once in public. The MPs watched, ashamed, their earlier smirks replaced by the kind of raw realization that gnaws at a man long after the moment has passed. The general turned to them, his eyes like steel drawn in fire. "Do you know who you stopped?" he demanded, his voice carrying down the gravel road. "She ran vector ops, so classified I still can't read half the reports. Ghost Hawk doesn't exist on paper, but when it did, it saved lives you'll never even hear about." The two MPs snapped to rigid attention, their throats dry, and the woman, calm as ever, adjusted her pack strap and said only one sentence before walking past them into the convoy's escort. "Respect isn't claimed. It's carried." And as her steps faded into the sound of engines starting, every soldier at that gate knew something had shifted, something that would follow them into every salute and every quiet moment of duty from that day forward. Because you don't forget the day a ghost walked out of rumor and into reality, carrying nothing more than a worn patch that told the truth louder than any uniform ever could. The ride through the compound was silent except for the steady hum of engines. But inside those black SUVs the weight of history sat heavier than steel, because everyone knew this wasn't an escort for a routine visit. It was a recognition long overdue, a reckoning disguised as protocol. And when the convoy stopped in front of the operations hall, soldiers who had been leaning casually against walls or smoking near the motor pool suddenly stiffened, their eyes drawn to the sight of a young woman, stepping out with nothing more than a weathered pack on her shoulders and a frayed patch that seemed to radiate more authority than any badge or bar around her. And in that moment whispers began threading through the air like sparks on dry grass. "Ghost Hawk. Vector 1. She's real." They had heard stories passed like contraband during long night watches, stories of reconnaissance teams who vanished into mountains for weeks and returned with intel that shifted wars. Stories of soldiers who could walk through fire without leaving ash behind. Stories so wild no one dared believe them, because believing meant admitting there were warriors whose names would never appear on plaques or parade rosters. But now one of those ghosts was here, and she wasn't hidden behind legends anymore. She was flesh and bone, walking steady through the gates, as if each step was a reminder that the ones who carry the hardest burdens rarely need to raise their voices. The general at her side spoke low to her, deferential, but she never broke stride, her eyes fixed forward, her silence louder than any command. When they entered the hall, every chair scraped back at once, cadets and officers alike scrambling upright without instruction, because instinct told them what orders had not, that respect had just walked into the room. She placed her pack down on the podium, unzipped it with deliberate care, and drew out not weapons, not files, but a single folded cloth, black, worn, stitched with the same hawk insignia that had stopped the MPs in their tracks. She unfolded it across the podium, and the room held its breath. "This isn't for display," she said finally, her voice steady, carrying to every corner without strain. "It was carried into places you'll never read about. It belongs to the ones who didn't come back." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rustle of uniforms as men and women in that hall slowly straightened, ashamed of every joke they had ever made about quiet veterans, ashamed of every eye roll they had thrown at stories they thought were exaggerated. The general stepped forward, his face solemn, and addressed them directly. "You mocked her at the gate because you saw a youth in silence. You didn't see that this woman wrote the doctrine half of you recited in basic training. You didn't see that she carried men out of kill zones you'll never even find on a map. Ghost Hawk, Vector 1, wasn't a rumor. It was her call sign." A ripple moved through the room like a physical force, heads lowering, hearts tightening, because it was one thing to hear legends, and another to see the person who had lived them standing before you, without a single metal pin to her chest. She looked out at them then, her gaze steady, her words measured. "Respect isn't loud. It isn't demanded. It's earned when no one is watching. And if you forget that, if you think rank or uniform alone makes you untouchable, you've already failed." Then she lifted the patch from the pack, running her thumb along its frayed edge, and pinned it to the podium. "This stays here," she said, "to remind you that not every warrior is seen, but every warrior matters." The room rose to attention without command, the sound of boots snapping to the floor echoing like thunder, and in that moment no one saw a woman in her 20s with a worn back. They saw a soldier who had carried the invisible weight of silence, a veteran whose legacy was stitched into fabric but carved into history. When she turned to leave, the salute that followed her out wasn't just protocol. It was the kind of reverence that only comes when arrogance finally bows to truth, and long after her convoy rolled away, soldiers still stood at attention, their hearts branded by the reminder that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that barely speak at all.